the reason that you use AI and Gen AI in different parts of your organization will require a different both nature of integration, different KPIs, and different organizational ownership in order to make it work. And I think that getting this clarity and understanding that it's not about the technology, but what the technology can do for you in combination is the single most important lesson that I'd like us to draw from that and what differentiates between failure and success. In most cases that I've seen in terms of specific projects, you will end up being part of someone else's ecosystem, but orchestrating your own webs of relationships, finding incentives for people to want to work with you because that's how they get value and how you get a slice of their value because your joint offering is going to be better.
I think what the market is trying to tell the world is that the market believes that most of the value in the current configuration of things is going to be captured by the hyperscalers and the cloud giants and not so much by the other kind of SaaS vendors, right? And I think there's some point to that.
Learn how to master cloud marketplaces in just 5 weeks with our cohort course. Accelerate your growth by tapping into the $300+ billion cloud spend that enterprises have committed to AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. Discover the future of go-to-market with Roman. During 10 weekly sessions, you'll learn how to leverage this fast-growing channel and network with top industry experts and partnership leaders. We will dive into marketplace strategies, internal buy-in, building relationships with the cloud, and mastering co-sell. Join our upcoming cohort.
Good to be back with our AI podcast about how AI is changing business and ecosystems. I'm super excited to have with us two incredible guests. Michael Jacobides, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship from London Business School, one of the top opinion leader on ecosystem globally, person who is speaking literally in every location from World Economic Forum to corporate boards, and Zhang, who is advisor to VC fund, billion-dollar VC fund, and until recently COO of PolyAI. PolyAI is one of the UK AI darlings, and he's been leading the sales, partnerships, and operations. So we have both academia and practitioner in the room. So I think we're going to be getting a lot of insights on how companies adopting AI today, how they changing business model, and how they build the ecosystem under the influence of AI. So I guess the first question for you, Michael, you've done recently incredible research, which is like very grounded in data. I would recommend, by the way, everyone to take a look at that on how companies implement AI in their day-to-day. So can you talk a little bit more, like what are the things that you found interesting, unexpected, and what business leaders can learn from?
So first of all, let me give a bit of context, because the work that you're referring to, it's work that we did with the Institute of Directors, one of the major global private equity firms, and Evolution Limited, the advisory that I lead in terms of the more hands-on stuff, in addition to the academic work, was focused on Gen AI. And generative AI, although technically is very closely related to AI, is, for a number of reasons, a very different beast. So the question that we wanted to look at is in particular focused on Gen AI. Now, the two end up being complements, but before we think about all of that good stuff, let me say that we are only now starting to get a sense of what's happening in terms of Gen AI. What is the bottom line? The way that we saw it, both in terms of qualitative work and quantitative work, and some of the advisory projects we've been involved in. It is a strange combination of there being both significant hype and not taking enough advantage of what this technology can offer. Because it's a strange technology. It's a technology that was developed with an historically entirely unprecedented funding that existed to develop something that is cool. And you had a bunch of geeks that said, I'm going to build cool tools, especially in terms of Gen AI. And then everyone's been jumping up and down saying, my God, this technology is really powerful. What do we do with it? Boards have said, gosh, this is important. And you've got this weird sense whereby boards are writing very big checks. But then if you go further down in the organization, and I was thinking about even very large, sophisticated organizations, they have both the go-ahead and the funding to say, go do Gen AI. people are looking at the cell saying, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to integrate it. So you've got this bizarre thing that there is excitement, and I'm going to bet you that we will see disappointment emerge over the next few months because people have been funding without thinking about what needs to complement Gen AI in order to make it productive. So we've been trying to address something which isn't really the bottleneck, and without thinking carefully about what you do. At the same time, Gen AI, I mean, just last week we had amazing developments in terms of the creation of independent and autonomous agents, and you can start writing your own apps like there's no tomorrow and doing a bunch of things that you were not able to. So you will see lots of new opportunities that emerge that will be challenging existing firms. So we're in the very funny and historically unprecedented kind of place where I think that there is both excessive hype because people know it's important, but they haven't translated for their own organizations, and sometimes an underappreciation of what the technology can do. That's sort of the headline that I've seen.
Amazing. We will return to research in a minute, but let me ask a question to Jan. Jan, you one of the geeks possibly, right, who played with Gen AI and AI in general, and you implemented it very successfully. Incredible company. Can you talk a little bit more? What do you see in the industry these days in terms of companies implementing AI? What are the most successful use cases that you've seen?
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of context as well, just a couple of sentences to set the scene. So until earlier this year, and for the past 5 years, I was the chief operating officer of a company called PolyAI, right? So Poly is a London-based company, and it sells voice assistants to large enterprises. So this is the bot that you speak to when you call up customer service. It's an experience that a lot of people find frustrating, and our mission was to make it less frustrating using AI, right? So really allowing people to use back and forth conversations to kind of solve their problems, and tremendously helped by AI and Gen AI. And so we're now a late stage post-Series C company, 150 people. We serve millions of calls a year. Where I've seen success in the deployment of Gen AI, several areas. One is so Gen AI, in the sense that it fits or it augments or replaces a human workflow, fits best or fixed is most quickly fitted in workflows that's already been outsourced. Right, so you see a lot of adoption in types of workflows that have been traditionally outsourced to BPOs, whether that is customer service, whether that is content moderation, whether that is document repository processing and things of that sort. Because again, when you do things one way in the enterprise and you got to do another way, you have to make a lot of organizational changes, and those organizational changes, which I'm sure we'll get to later, provide a lot of friction against transformation. So things that have already been carved out of the organization is things that are the first to be automated with Gen AI. A couple other places, obviously things that help other AI companies, right? So components of other AI companies. So we at PolyAI, as a full-fledged enterprise voice assistant, use voice recognition. We use LLMs, and we use text-to-speech, right, which is a synthesized voice. And you're finding a lot of success in those component companies helping AI products or AI companies making products. And the last is, I think, augmentation or co-pilots, right, is hugely successful. We're seeing a lot of adoption in sales automation, right, in companies that's using AI to help outbound or enter in details into the CRM, right? So those are hugely successful and getting a lot of traction right now.
Amazing. Michael, I think one of the insightful things that I found in your research is that you looked at transformation potential of different industries, right? And on top of that, you looked at data moat as a way to for companies to approximate what is the value they can get from applying Gen AI. Can you talk a little bit more about how do you see executives seeing the value in applying AI, potential in applying AI, and where do they see potential moats? And
let me draw on that, and let me just say that what we're finding is consistent with what you just saying a moment ago, Jan. And one of the features, for instance, that we see is correlated with both the use of and the satisfaction from using AI, Gen AI in particular, is the extent of modularization. And it kind of makes sense, right? And this is why the companies that already have a digital DNA and infrastructure where things are modularized, created, and neater little packages can say, this is ripe for me to put a solution that is AI or Gen AI based. Whereas if you have something which is much more integral, it is much harder to do. So that's sort of one thing. And that, by the way, will take us to why we expect that there's going to be a very heterogeneous both adoption and benefit from Gen AI. Let me shift to the core of the question that you asked, because and the way that I'll respond to it is to say that what we looked in this research is also not only whether organizations used Gen AI, but also whether Gen AI had low, moderate, or high impact. And there's a very interesting comparison between these different cases, and then say, can we find any rhyme or reason? Because it doesn't make so much sense to say, oh, are people generally excited or generally not excited? But where are they most excited? Where do they see most of the value? And what we find, there's a couple of things that I'd like to point to. One of the things that we find is that you have a much greater impact when you use it not only sporadically but systematically, and that goes back to the question about organization, i.e. something whereby your processes are molded so that they can accommodate Gen AI, but also where you start moving closer to doing things that affect the core of the organization. Those that report greater impact are those that are reporting the use in operations, in IT, in HR and legal, not just in writing emails. Everyone writes emails. The interesting question is, what do you do beyond that? Mm-hmm. The other thing which is interesting and perhaps is consistent, but moves us perhaps even more in a new direction, is that we find that the people that find the greatest excitement are those that don't only think about that as a cost saving. Lots of the of what you mentioned earlier on are organizations that say, great, let me reduce the labor bill, but also those that are trying to either benefit and expand on the opportunities of personalization at the mass level, or those that try to create new revenue models, new ways in which we're able to make money. So again, it has to do with the attitudes and the approach. You see this thing, which is this technology. What do you mold it to be? How do you actually drive it? And this is data that we have seen already about the present. In addition to that, we ask some more speculative questions, and that's going to give us the extra nuance, which is that we said, okay, guys, where do you expect that there's going to be greater impact? And that's where we started looking at the attributes either of what firms do or the type of knowledge that they have in order for them to drive advantage. But let me return to them a little later on, as I'm sure that Jan's going to have other interesting things to add.
Yeah. What do you think about like creating modes? Did you see companies having like a strategy to create like competitive mode around Gen AI or like AI in general?
Sure. Well, this is the question that many venture capitalists are asking, right? So if I invest in this generation of AI companies, won't just a better model or come along and replace what they do? So it's an interesting question. I don't think the jury is out on but this is my view, right? I think that these foundational models that everyone's really excited by, whether it's GPT-4 or Claude or Gemini, are representations of reality in one way. They're trained on kind of either text or images or multimodal signals, and they are not trained on solving problems per se. Right, so they're not observing, right, like how your company solves a particular workflow problem. And so for you to use these models to solve these problems, there is orchestration that's needed. So what are the components of the problem, right? So then what model do I use to solve this part of the problem? And then what model do I use to solve the second part of the problem? So in voice automation, for example, right, we use voice. We use voice recognition. We use an LLM to kind of think about what the problem is and what to say, and we use text to speech, right? And then every model spits out a signal that needs to be refined, and before you put it into the next model. And so then there is a lot of optimization that you have to create between the layers, right? And then so that you can be responsible for the final product, and that is non-trivial, right? To do it well, to create an end product using AI that is that uses, yes, these foundational models that are used by third parties, but then you're actually creating everything in between and putting it together. Not that different really from putting together a PC or a car, right? So you're adding a lot of value by optimizing the parts. Now, that's a moat, in my opinion, right? Now, how big or how severe that moat is depends on, well, first you have to have access to the problem. Not everybody has access to a specific corporate workflow, right? So if you want to moderate content, for example, you need to be familiar with the trust and safety rules of many different user-generated platforms, and then you need to know how you tune different models or how you orchestrate the different models to actually come up with a result that is going to be valuable, right? And so if you can then build a value on top of those models, that's kind of a moat. That's a pretty wide moat, right? So a lot of the questions I ask when I look at companies from a venture capital perspective is what kind of a privileged access do they have to the problem in the first place? And then if you have access to the problem, then you have access to the data, right? And the data is not just for you to train your models to perform better, but also just for you to create a product or an orchestrated kind of a stack of AI models to solve the problem. Now, the big question that's outstanding is that will a foundational model come out that's so smart, that's levels more intelligent, right, than what we have now, that it's going to figure out all of this in between steps, right? And that is a big question that everyone's holding out on the edge for. So I feel that if you really want to have a better answer to this question, we should wait after the release of GPT-5, right? Because if you measure the rate of improvement between GPT-4 and GPT-5, I think we'll have a fairly good answer for the next 5 to 10 years about whether these modes will persist.
Let me just add here, because what you just told us is a very thoughtful answer from the perspective of someone who needs to invest in an organization that says, hey, I have a great new solution. I put these things together, drawing on foundation models. And we already know, speaking of moats, that the cost that it takes and the data that is captured in foundational models already creates a huge amount of power, which is why regulation authorities are very likely concerned in terms of what that means for competition and whether we're going to end up having a very small number of firms pretty much squeezing the rest of the economy. And if so, what do we need to do to address that? But let's leave that to the side for a moment, because your focus is, okay, what about you, company, taking AI components from some of the uber powerful players, but also others, creating a package, offering the package. Is this package valuable? Is the glue that holds it together good enough? And it may sound that, hey, what's a car other than a bunch of components that a company puts together? Yeah, but they make more money than the component makers, right, because they have some secret sauce. So yep, it's an interesting question. On the other hand, what the focus that I have had is slightly different. It is to say, what are the impacts that this is going to have in existing sectors? So let's just park that for a while, because if you're going to think about most of the people listening to this podcast, they are not going to be people who are trying to put together a new company that builds AI. They are people who are trying to figure out, what the heck does that mean for me? Whether that I am a pharmacy, whether I am a hotel chain, whether I am a manufacturing company, whether I am a software writer, I just need to understand what I do in my own context. So the biggest part of the economy says, how will this meteor affect my life? Is this going to be the end of us dinosaurs and we're going to have new types of hairy mammals? Again, not just the people who are providing the tech, like the companies that you're either part of or funding, but at the level of the verticals. So this is where the second part of the work that we've done sort of comes in. And this is where I'm super excited to try to figure it out. And again, it's not that we have any crystal ball, but let me tell you the best guess that we have from the evidence that we have seen so far. It seems to us that it is unlikely to see an impact of Gen AI that is simply going to be good for profits because it creates use cases. And I've been shocked by the frivolity. I mean, McKinsey has a god-awful piece of work saying corporate profits will go up by 4.4 trillions, which is just, amazingly naive. And having spoken to the authors of the study, they said, oh yeah, we multiplied productivity investments by a very big number, and it's a very big number. And of course, if you wanted to convince people that your services are not expensive, you're like, look at this total addressable market, it's very big. But if we are a little bit more serious, and I think we all need to be starting to be more serious and more rigorous when it comes to assessing the impact of Gen AI, I think that you will see that there's going to be a heterogeneous impact with both some sectors and some business models having an impact and some types of firms. Let me tell you what we are seeing from the evidence that we had, drawing from the most recent research that we had. One of the things that we asked people is to say, what is your expectation of disruption? But then, on the basis of the qualitative work that we did, and some of the work that I had also done on the advisory side, we saw that it means very different things. And we said, let's try to unpack it. I said three things. First, disruption, and of course, everyone's going to have a very different idea. It's sometimes very sloppy and dangerous word. I'm sure that you've heard the word one time too many in corporate presentations and people who have pitch decks. But then we say, to what extent do you think that Gen AI might substitute what you offer? So, for instance, people in comms and advertising are rightly starting to feel very uncomfortable, and they should. And the reason is that the growth of Gen AI means that SEO, DEO, the efficiency of websites to find stuff, is now done by automated agents better than even seasoned professionals. And the reason that that's dangerous is that it means that currently, regulation will come into play again, a combination of Google and FMCGs can start squashing them out. Because in the past, you kind of needed the advertisers because they were doing things that you couldn't really replicate. Now you're like, hey, FMCG with Gen AI and Google, we can take care of all of it. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why currently Google's ad tech business is being aggressively pushed by the regulators in the United States, even more so than in Europe nowadays. So the question is, who's going to be really squeezed? What do we find? Well, we find, I should mention one third thing. We said, how are you going to be squeezed, how disruption will happen, but also, will Gen AI allow me to find a new way of leveraging advantage? And this is where you can think about it as hey, this technology will benefit me because I am more digitally positioned, I have better understanding of the data, I can integrate this technology better so I can use it to improve my position. What are the things that we find? We had a couple of questions, and there are two questions that are hugely predictive of disruption. The first question, which to me was a bit of a safety check because I wanted to make sure that the results are correct, is those industries and those business models where identifying patterns, pattern recognition is important. You see an expectation of disruption, an expectation of substitution, i.e. we're going to be all wiped out, but also a big expectation that some firms will be able to leverage their advantage. Kind of makes sense. That's what Gen AI does. Gen AI understands patterns and recreates patterns and, in creative and productive ways. The second thing that was even more important was the relevance of proprietary data, not of technical knowledge, not of tacit knowledge, but proprietary data. So we expect the areas whereby some nature, some notion of proprietary knowledge is important to be disrupted, potentially pushed to the side, but also where firms, those have superior knowledge, will be able to combine it with the technology and then move ahead, which I think is consistent with what you're seeing also at the venture level, because Gen AI operates on stuff, and the stuff is a better understanding of your environment and the possibility of, as we were saying, being modular in order to gain new ways of getting advantage. So we're now starting to create a bit of a map, and we can speak a little bit later on other aspects of this map that gives you a sense of who's going to be affected and who's not going to be affected, but also what are the buttons that you need to push.
Right. Amazing insights from both of you. And I'd like to piggyback on this. Maybe let's talk about how companies should change in terms of change management, how they should change like structure. And I think what is super interesting from you, Jan, to maybe to ask you, you worked in a AI first startup, right?
Sure.
And I'm curious, how do you think that AI first startups operate differently in the sense that what are the things that others could learn from it?
Yeah. So I think if you compare AI startups with the previous generation of SaaS, right? I think the capabilities of the technology is a little bit different, right? And I would say that if you're coding SaaS and it may be very cumbersome and its impact might be limited, but it works if you configure everything right. It's supposed to work on day one, right? And it often doesn't, but it's a deterministic system, right? So you put something in and something comes out. AI is a non-deterministic system, right? And so not everything works on day one, and then not everything might work on day 60 or as business as usual, right? And so there are lots of edge cases. The whole game of trying to make AI useful is how do you deal with the edge cases that might come out, and then in every use case you will find edge cases that are difficult, that are minor, that are frequent, infrequent, and a lot of AI implementation is taking care of those edge cases. So the big difference is that you tend to see more services, right, that complement AI companies than services that complement traditional SaaS. And so, whether it is a more rigorous monitoring system where you are trying to get rid of edge cases or automate edge cases, or you have a human fallback, right? In the sense that I know that this is only going to work 80% of the time, but it's very smart, but I need a human fallback to make sure that the results are good, right? So you kind of have to complement and couple those services with the AI. Now, that gives you a little bit of different margin structure. It gives you a little bit of, it's a different profile of business. And a lot of venture capitalists are not 100% comfortable with the type of margin profile of a mostly tech, but a little bit of a services type of company. And I'm sure that we'll talk about partnerships in a little bit, also changes the dynamics of potential partnerships as well as you go to market.
Yeah, Michael, when you hear this, how do you think like traditional companies should change? And also, I think one data point that I bookmarked from your research was that when leadership is involved in applying Gen AI, right, in the business, the 31% high chances of success, right? Like, can you talk a little bit more about what?
So I think, let me complement it, because again, I think that here you see two consistent complementary approaches because you focus on a different thing. One question is, how does this technology require even a venture to think about the world differently? Because the product is different, because the way that you refine it, the way that you evolve it is different when you are a company that produces it. Now, when you are a traditional company, I think that we're in a slightly different kettle of fish. And I think that what we see, so let me sort of give you some of the sort of quick summaries of what we see. We see that larger companies that are the ones that you should expect have the possibility of adopting Gen AI end up having and also may have better better data structures, proprietary data, information infrastructures, may end up having greater problems because they hesitate. That's where legal, that's where HR comes, says, no, you need to be very careful, don't do sort of anything that is crazy, whereas some other organizations may be able to be more adventuresome. And I think that we may end up seeing some bimodality with lots of companies in the middle that are too scared to do the jump properly, and some of the very small companies who say, forget it, this is important, we need to experiment, we need to get that right, and we'll have a take it as it goes kind of approach, which, as you can hear, is part and parcel of the way that Gen AI and AI is currently being implemented, and the big ones that can find ways of sort of systematizing it to some extent and ring fencing it so that it does not destroy corporate reputation, but still you're able to try it. So that means that it is becoming a little more difficult for some companies than others to use it. That's sort of the first thing. The second thing that I'd say is that it is important to ensure that for you to see a benefit, you don't view it only as a technology, or that you are sophisticated in understanding why you're using it. And let me now put a prescriptive hat on, because in addition to the research, we've done a little bit of rolling up our sleeves in Evolution Limited and said, okay, can we find ways in which organizations can take advantage of Gen AI? And the answer is yes, by not focusing on Gen AI. What do I mean? Gen AI, if you think about it, is a technology that can essentially go and seek answers and create plausible answers on the basis of the data that you give it. And it is this narrow focus. On the other hand, it requires some strategic capabilities like the data engineering that is going to provide it the right kind of data, and that's sort of the upstream part, but also the downstream part in a sense, which is the embedding the insights into the operations and linking them to the product that you get. And then when you go and you think about it, you're like, well, that might also really work when you have some strategic assets. Strategic asset could be the proprietary data and the other knowledge assets that you can create, or the repertoire of answers that might potentially give some network externalities that can be tomorrow's moat, because you are able to create a finer understanding both of what your customers need and how to respond to these customers. That means that your customers will end up being stickier. So ironically, most of the people I see focusing on the technology itself, which is kind of missing the point, because what you need to think is what are the complements of this technology in terms of the strategic capabilities and the strategic assets in terms of the pre and the post in order to be able to drive this transformation. The nature of skills that you need as an organization also depends on what can this technology do for you. So the problem is that as a technology, it can do a number of things, but what do you want it for? Do you want it to simply reduce the cost of human labor, or do you want it to do this and a bit of personalization in order to make people feel that they're heard? We all love being heard. Or is it something that is going to generate a new business model? Depending on what this technology should do for you, you need to have different people leading the process. And that's why I wanted to preface that before saying that it is important for senior leadership to be involved, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all which says you always need to have a CEO involvement and it always needs to be part of the CTO. No, it may need to be part of the COO mission. It may need to be part of the people who run business development or strategy, depending on what you want to do. So in a way, going back to some discussions we may have had a long time ago, thinking about ecosystem strategy, yeah, well, you have a strategy in the same way that you have a strategy for M&A. You need to understand why you're doing it. It's not that every M&A is the same. You buy some stuff because it's got good IP. You buy some stuff because you've got good people. You buy some stuff because you enter new technologies. The way that you would approach these M&As are going to be different. Similarly, the reason that you use AI and Gen AI in different parts of your organization will require a different both nature of integration, different KPIs, and different organizational ownership in order to make it work. And I think that getting this clarity and understanding that it's not about the technology, but what the technology can do for you in combination is the single most important lesson that I'd like us to draw from that, and what differentiates between failure and success in my book.
Incredible. I found your point, and from your research, that companies who integrate very deeply getting more success. Very insightful. And also, I've heard recent research from Stanford when they ask a bunch of people, not like a huge number, but some corporate leaders, how do they implement Gen AI in their companies? Whether they implement, the majority said yes. Like, what do they do with it? And they said, like, we built a chatbot. Sort of the majority of them build a chatbot, and they ask, like, is it useful? And sort of 90% said no. So I guess the point that you're making about kind of thinking through the use cases and thinking through the use case first is incredible. Let's shift gears towards an ecosystem discussion, because I think in AI, ecosystem discussion is front and center. Everyone is talking about open versus closed ecosystem. One thing that I'm sort of fascinated is, especially in tech, it seems that in technology, a lot of companies woke up sort of early to Gen AI, and they started implementing like Salesforce and all of them, like all the giants started like investing in Gen AI. Yet, if you compare like emerging cloud index, which is like all great technology companies, versus hyperscalers, like 3 hyperscalers went up in value more than $1 trillion this year, versus all these great companies went down in value $150 billion. So there's a disparity between who is getting value from Gen AI. And would love your sort of perspective on how AI ecosystems are evolving, how they emerging actually, and maybe starting from you.
Sure. Well, I think what the market is trying to tell the world is that the market believes that most of the value, as the market lays, in the current configuration of things, is going to be captured by the hyperscalers and the cloud giants, and not so much by the cloud, the other kind of SaaS vendors, right? And I think there's some point to that. I think that it is not at all clear exactly how Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and OpenAI and these companies are going to capture value in the long term, right? We haven't really settled down, but still, they have the best scientists, they have all the compute power, they have all the capital, and they're well positioned. However, the market's going to shake out. When you look at companies that are downstream from that, right? So SaaS really fall into 2 different buckets. It's either a system of record of some sort, or it's an automation, workflow automation of some sort. And if you look at both of those buckets of SaaS companies, it's not clear that their form factor is going to remain the same, or as AI becomes more dominant. Do you still need Salesforce as it is today, which is a CRM with lots of different fields that someone has to go fill out, when AI is doing a lot of the actual business processes, right? It probably will look different. Do you need exactly UiPath in the way, which is robotic process automation, or other RPA companies, when AI, to configure you to kind of enter the information into these different fields, when AI can do something very similar, right? So the form factors are not the same, and you don't really know whether those companies are going to thrive and survive, right? So that's what the market is telling you.
I think, it's interesting. I would start venturing to make some bets, so that, for instance, I'd be much more concerned if I was Salesforce than if I was SAP, in the sense that CRM is much more on the chopping block than ERP, because you need a single source of truth. It is more valuable to have some information. Note of conflict, have worked a bit with SAP over the last year. But what's interesting, and the reason that I think that they are excited about it, which makes sense to me, is that if you can say that we are offering the base that you can use to get insights and we can clean it because we hold this system, then you are on a safer footing. If your value add, like Salesforce, is to essentially create something which is a heavily scripted guide on the way that you can get information from and to customers, that's what this new technology does. So what you will see, I think, with some of these providers is to say, what is that this technology is doing? And you need to complement that. And again, we're going back to, is this technology the sort of creating this search and find answers, or do you have some of these cloud providers that are important in the associated strategic assets and capabilities? If the latter, they'll keep their position if they play their hands right. If the former, they're going to be much more challenged. The other thing that I'd say is there's a fascinating report that the Competition Market Authority had in terms of the nature of the foundation models, and they're starting to be rightly concerned about the creation of ever tighter webs of relationships, ever tighter ecosystems between some small set of the big tech players and all of the ventures that have emerged. So if you look at OpenAI, Anthropic, all of the new companies have very tight connections with the same 6-7 players. Nvidia, for instance, is now trying to, and I think that you had a massive increase in power. Is there hot air in Nvidia? Sure. But on the other hand, you just think about the value they've created. It is by trying to build a strong ecosystem so that when the technology is less hard to replicate than it is right now, they have created a staying power to all of their complements by putting them on their own software, by creating things that create switching costs that mean that those who are writing program for things that Nvidia has provided will on the margin want to continue working with Nvidia. So I think that Nvidia is playing an ecosystem game in order to prepare itself for the inevitable time that it isn't as difficult to create the chips as it is today. Because today, it holds a key that is super valuable. This will stop happening anytime we have technological bottlenecks of that sort. They move because other people say there's money in the pavement. So it's interesting because you see ecosystem plays becoming super important. You see concentration and the top players cementing their position, which is reflected in the market capitalizations that you see because they're trying to make them sort of more congenial to their own interests. But you also see another interesting thing. I think that let me go a little bit sort of macro and abstract here. If you think about the nature of organizations, information, communication, computation technologies have always been very important in driving which form makes sense. It is the growth of the telegram and of railroads that made some of the large integrated organizations in the turn of the century become so successful in America and then be exported here. Now you have technologies that make it easier to go look not only inside our own boundaries, but outside. So a very different approach, which may be relevant for many of the people we're speaking about, because we're not providing advice to Google and Nvidia here. We're, I think, thinking about the people listening to the podcast who work in organizations that are sort of closer to normal life or not the big tech, is that you may start thinking, hang on a minute, is this technology lubricating the possibilities of connecting with those outside? Is it making it easier for me to cross outside, to think about new combinations, to facilitate things like contracts or searching the market? The answer is an absolute yes. And I think that you will see also, I'm taking a bit of a punt here, that you can tell us how even in the world of ventures, people are starting to be much more interested in building ecosystems with other players, because also there is a much greater fluidity and we don't know where the market is going. So nobody's trying to create more integral solutions. So at the macro level, ecosystem strategies are important. They are driving dominance of a few players. They are rightly becoming the focus of regulatory action. And there's a heck of a lot of PR spend from big tech that says, oh, that's against innovation. Rubbish. But also for normal firms, it is becoming something that I think will be ever more present, and I expect clever ecosystem plays to be an even greater ingredient to success and failure as go on. But I'm curious to see how things work from your side of the world, as it were, when you're looking at it from the ventures you're involved in.
Well, I think so. You're absolutely right, and I think that a lot of these, besides the enterprises themselves making strategic moves, all of them have CVCs, right, corporate venture wings, and they are making bets, right, in application layer companies, so that to make sure that if their infrastructure products are not being used, then at least they have a fairly good data on who's using what, so that they can be making the strategic move. So that's absolutely true, and I think that the other thing that we have to look at, which I wanted to talk about, which is that ecosystems really form the physics of ecosystems is incentives, right? And the AI is bringing a different set of incentives into the ecosystem, right? So traditionally, you've had these kind of in the traditional cloud SaaS world, you've had these hyperscalers, cloud giants, who are trying to kind of rope in as many kind of application layer partners as possible into their ecosystem, so that they could be selling more cloud. And then on the other side, you have kind of implementation giants like Accenture and Deloitte also kind of bringing application layer companies to market, right? And I think that type of general configuration will still persist, but the incentives are just a little bit different, which is that AI, as I said, is spinning out different types of professional services, right, for implementation. Some of it is more profitable for the SIs to do, the systems integrator to do. Some of it taking away, right, like are there going to be billion-dollar Salesforce implementations in 10 years, right? Which is the bread and butter of a lot of these SIs, right? So I think that's really interesting, right? And then also your partnerships with Amazon or AWS or GCP or Microsoft, in terms of they want you to get enterprises to spend their cloud commitments, right? But at this point, when you're using different models, when you're using models from OpenAI and Google to create your products, how will the hyperscaler ecosystems persist, right? I think it's a space that's interesting to watch.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. I think we will talk about orchestrators versus complementers and how companies should think through that in a second. But before we jump into that, Michael, you are world leader of thinking through closed versus open ecosystems, right? And kind of I think what is interesting dynamic which is emerging right now is that we have hyperscalers kind of dominating the space. We have OpenAI, which has surpassed like 1 million paid enterprise users. We have Llama, which is used by 350,000 downloads. So we have like new, pretty limited set of players, but we also have a lot of enterprises that would imagine that they would become also AI players. How do you think the dynamic of open versus closed ecosystem will be changed by AI, if at all?
Well, look, one of the things that you see in ecosystems, not just in terms of AI, but in any ecosystem, is that there is a self-professed excitement with openness from organizations that simply try to enlist support, and then once they start ruling the world, they start cracking the whip. And sadly, we have seen that in one case too many. Again, the reason that I spent a couple of years looking at regulation is that I felt that spending time in ecosystems, my soul will burn in hell eternally if we couldn't say, hang on a minute, we have an issue here. And I think that what you see is that sometimes they are so bloody narrow-mindedly wanting to own everything that they undermine themselves. And that's the link to the metaverse that you were saying earlier on. It was kind of fun. I was looking at the evolution of the metaverse as it was happening in a project. I'm an academic advisor to the Henderson Institute of BCG. We had a big project on AI back in 2020, 21, before it was quite as exciting. And then we said, well, let's look at the metaverse because everyone's looking at the metaverse. So when we look at the metaverse, we saw that the metaverse folded partly because of a very narrow-minded strategy in terms of ecosystem plays. Meta wanted to hold everything. They went and they bought a company making hardware that was not terribly good, turns out, and latency was very small, but all they cared about is give me 47.5% of your top line, and then we're speaking, because they loved the idea of having this bottleneck. And it's interesting that I think they have been humbled into seeing the light of being more open in the sense of more strategically open, because you can benefit as an orchestrator not only by holding everything, having a total lock, but having a hardware lock or a content lock or a platform lock, depending on where you see. And you now see Zuckerberg saying, oh, we are much more open, and you will see them that in the metaverse, they are saying we're going to want to be the Android of, rather than hold the whole system the way that they did up until a few months ago. And they also have had, and that's probably his sort of chief AI scientist has been a proponent of it, and I think that he's now listening to Jan more, saying we're going to also be much more open when it comes to the development of AI. Apple is the opposite. Apple is famously and always a little bit more closed, and there is perhaps an incentive too many of wanting to control it. So I think that this is a delicate thing, right? Because companies sometimes can be a little bit, once they feel that they have the power to do so, they want to run the world. They have understood that a combination of bad PR and regulatory attention should limit their efforts to be quite as closed. But I still think that there is a bias. I think that being more thoughtful about where you are open and when you're closed, and being more focused on joint value creation with a sensible, fairly straightforward distribution of value, as opposed to wanting to be greedy and focusing everything to yourself, is a more effective solution. It's interesting that the Gen AI has worked because the people who were involved in it had slightly different incentives. I mean, the original structure of OpenAI was capped. The people there were more idealists, and we have seen how the links with Microsoft are starting to change all that. So I think there's a bit of soul searching in the field, because people feel that they must be more open, but there is unfortunately a tendency, one, you can afford to not be open, to try to close things down. And I think that we're not going to move away from this seesaw with excesses on either side. I'd really be curious to see what you're seeing from the world right now in this regard.
Yeah, I think the jury's still out on what the ecosystem in AI looks like, right? Because ecosystems are built around, as you point out, like kind of bottlenecks, right? Who's the most valuable player in who are the most valuable players in the ecosystem, and the ecosystem kind of is built around them. Like in cloud, you have three giant, well-capitalized companies competing in cloud, right? And I'm not sure if the AI ecosystem is going to be built around foundational models.
Yeah.
Because there are actually like 11 or 12 of them, and they, Claude is really good at agentic behavior, but next week, who knows, right? That's, the value is not really accruing there. At the present moment, the choke point is the chip, right? Is the chip and actually talent, right? So ecosystems are actually probably being built around Nvidia, right? And if we expand this discussion to a global level, you have separate ecosystems that do not have access to Nvidia, like China or Russia, right? And you have different ecosystems being built there around AI, right? And so I think, but as Professor Jacobides said, the choke point around Nvidia is not a permanent one, right? So I do think that it is a jury still out on what the ecosystem will be built around.
Can I just jump in here, because fantastic observations. Let me just add that another dimension that will end up being more important in the near future, it's already become very important over the last few years, is geopolitics.
Yep.
And it's interesting that we start seeing this being important in a previous ecosystem war. Had been slightly involved with them as well, looking at what happened with Huawei, because they were pushed off the Android ecosystem by Trump, and it was clearly not something that had to do with the security. That's the network equipment. That was just they're like, well, we want to have someone who doesn't get too much share in our ecosystem, as it were. The result was that they developed an ecosystem of their own. Right now, they are one of the leading contenders for the AI chips, which are at this stage not working well. But I think that it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves, and how the dynamics shift. The reason that I'm mentioning that is that we are moving, whoever wins the American elections, we are still moving in a multipolar world. And there's going to be one bloc that is US dominated, one bloc that is EU dominated. Well, it's sort of trying, and there's internal discord still. There's going to be a bloc kind of there. Then there is another one that's China and the UK trying to have influence to the extent that it can. Sadly, not quite as easy. But I think that this will also affect ecosystems. We saw that, by the way, in the previous piece of work that we did in AI, where we saw that not only were the ecosystems different when you looked at AI, the work that we did with VHI earlier, but that the role of the state differed in China, in the US, and in Europe. China, I think, is kind of the wet dream of a French interventionist, where the government sort of says, this is what different companies should do, and Ali is tasked to modernize part of the Chinese economy and get them on the cloud and train them up and so on and so forth. Whereas in the US, it's a more traditional adversarial, but we'll give you big government support, and we're going to have some friends that we engage and develop this way. Ironically, Musk is the beneficiary of state government contracts like nobody's business, although he plays the libertarian tune. And in Europe, there is a slightly different set of protectionism. I think that we will see geopolitics play a role, shape ecosystems also. How will that play out? I don't know. But the biggest question is the one that you were saying, which is, it's not clear whether we will have a world whereby the foundation models are a modular complement to the strong ecosystems, which will be around the hyperscaling and the existence of the data, or if it is going to be something entirely different. This is one of the biggest value distribution sort of battles that I think we will have ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Cannot agree more, and I think we can spend another hour talking about Nvidia. I think they're making a lot of smart plays, right? So they have software, they work with all hyperscalers, and I think what I'm also fascinated what this kind of new age brought to us is as how everyone is like collaborating while competing with each other, and this is actually one of the kind of paradigm shift that I think a lot of companies should embrace. But as we sort of close in, get into the close, I would love us to talk a little bit more about orchestrators versus complementarians mentality. And what I mean by that, when I hear the discussion like about AI, it sounds like there's going to be sort of very small defined number of orchestrators, and everyone else going to be complementary, right? And I think you Michael mentioned in your research the power of complementarians, but complementarians have power to shape to some extent the orchestrators. But like, I'm curious, how do you, when you advise companies and when you talk about, when they ask you whether should they try to be orchestrators, whether you should try to be complementarians, and if complementarians, and how, like what do you say to them?
Well, look, I think that the biggest problem that I have is delusion of grandeur. I think that it comes down to, and usually it is alpha males, not alpha females, that want to say that I'm going to be leading that thing and I'll be orchestrating it. And you're like, well, you may be getting the wrong messages here, because if you think that, hey, all these big companies are orchestrators, and as a result, I should be an orchestrator, it's just thinking about causation the other way around. They have powers that you don't. The question is, given where you are, what can you do? And I think that a clever way of partnering, or a way in which you find what they are unable to do, the data they do not have, the functions that are too idiosyncratic to your value add that you can develop, is what you should be focusing on. Rather than saying, I'm going to see them and emulate them, you should say, I'm going to see them, I'm going to see the impact on what the landscape looks like. I'm going to think long and hard about what is it that I'm bringing to the table, how this can be combined with a new technology, and then how I can put it together. Ironically, you will end up, in most cases that I've seen in terms of specific projects, you will end up being part of someone else's ecosystem, but orchestrating your own webs of relationships, finding incentives for people to want to work with you because that's how they get value and how you get a slice of their value because your joint offering is going to be better. So it is knowing where you orchestrate and where you partner. You start by saying, I need to play with some of the big players, but I also can benefit from external collaborations. So it's not an either or. You try to see where you should simply steer clear of deluding yourself and then how you organize them. But for the final word of wisdom, I'll defer to you.
Thank you. Well, I didn't expect to have the final word of wisdom, but what I wanted to say and emphasize maybe a little bit more in this conversation is really the role of embedded incentives within organizations, right? Which is to say that a lot of it, whether you're an orchestrator or a complementer, as Professor Jacobides said, it is about ego, right? It is about like a maybe a past the prime kind of vision of who you really are and what you do in the ecosystem, and I think one of the things that I've observed in kind of automating, right, phone calls, which is a big use case for AI, right, is that you would think that the incumbent large BPOs in the world, right, the Teleperformances and the Concentrixes of the world, would have come up with this a little bit earlier because they had all the capital and they had all the access to data, right? But then it is not out of necessarily ego or necessarily like an inability to change, but there are embedded incentives within these organizations that are really, really difficult to change, right? So an example is that a lot of call centers traditionally charge by resource, so how many people are in the program, right? And they've been trying for years to move it to kind of a results-based or contract system, but it's not that possible because it's not that the former model is backwards, right? It's that when you're actually taking, well, I'm getting a tiny bit technical here, when you're taking calls into a contact center, right? This is, by the way, a business process that are taught in many courses here at LBS. Is that, if you want to be able to pick up everyone's calls within a reasonable amount of wait time, you need to have a little bit of slack, right? So people have to, you can't have people on 100% utility, right? So that type of a configuration causes you to want to have a per resource type of contract because availability is value, right? And so availability has to be charged as a value. So totally reasonable, completely rational. But guess what? AI doesn't have these restraints, right? So when AI can pick up the phone, like it can do so 100% utility all the time, right? And so all of a sudden, AI vendors are very willing to charge on a per result or per active minute type of model, and these companies can't catch up. And that incentive is so deeply embedded in how they do things because if you get rid of it, promotions, bonuses, people's places, right? Revenue, margins, these things all have to change, right? So it is really difficult. As Professor Jacobides says, you really have to have someone on the very top of the organization saying, we are absolutely going to do things differently, right? In order to make the right decision about where you play in the ecosystem in the future, right? And it's going to take tremendous leadership from a whole bunch of companies.
Absolutely.
This is like an amazing note to wrap up, and thank you so much. It's been like incredibly insightful conversation. I'm really learned a lot myself, and look forward to many more of this. And I'm very pleased to have been joined today by Michael Jacobides, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship here in London Business School, and Zhang, advisor of VC Fund and former CEO of PolyAI. Thanks so much, and until the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.